Hello, and welcome to Why Does It Matter, a student-led program here at UCF that examines topical issues in U.S. foreign affairs. I'm joined here today by my Global Perspectives and International Initiatives colleague, Mirvate El Jerdi. The topic of our very first episode today is fragile and failed states. To answer the question, why should they matter to the United States, we're joined by the Assistant to the Administrator for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization at the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, Rob Jenkins. A member of the U.S. government's senior executive service, Rob has dedicated his entire career to peace building, political transitions, and conflict prevention overseas. If there's anyone who can answer why failed and fragile states should matter to us, it's Rob. So thank you, Rob, for being our guest today. To introduce our student panelists and to moderate the discussion, I'll now turn it over to Dr. Jonathan Powell, Associate Professor in UCF's School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen, and thank you, Mirvate, for helping to put this together. And of course, thank you for our guest, Rob Jenkins. I'll begin with introducing each of the students who are going to be participating. First, Abbey Reynolds is a UCF undergraduate. Last year, she completed her honors thesis titled Understanding the Impact of Disease Burden on Civil Liberty. She recently had a paper on Africa's recent spike in military coups published in Conflict Trends, a journal published by the African Center on the Constructive Resolution of Disputes. She's currently serving in Nairobi as a Boren Scholar studying Swahili. Devyn Escalanti is a second-year Security Studies PhD student. She earlier completed her bachelor's and master's degrees from UCF, so she's a veteran of our programs. Her research focuses on security threats from non-traditional perspectives while using advanced quantitative methodologies and things like geographic information systems. Her dissertation involves assessing the relationship between infectious diseases and political violence, primarily within the context of sub-Saharan Africa. And finally, we have Salah bin Hamu, also a second-year Security Studies PhD student, another veteran of our undergraduate program. His research primarily focuses on civil-military relations and democratization in the Middle East and North Africa. And his work has been published in academic journals such as International Studies Review and Journal of Global Security Studies, as well as in popular outlets such as the Washington Post and Political Violence at a Glance. So to get started, I'm going to turn it over to Abbey Reynolds to ask her first question.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for being here, Mr. Jenkins. So I'm just going to start off with like a two-part question. So if you could just tell us what is a fragile or failed state and what implications do these kinds of states have for U.S. national security interests?
Well, thank you, Abby, and congratulations on your fellowship. I hope it's a beautiful day in Nairobi. It's a wonderful place to spend some time. And full disclosure, I never even went to graduate school, so I should be learning from all of you. I spent some time in Africa, then I got a job with the U.S. government for a year or two to decide, well, I decided what I wanted to do with my life. And I got stuck here and I can't leave because I love it too much. And I don't think anyone will hire me without a graduate degree. But your question is a simple one. What is a fragile state? Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you. There's a lot of different ways to define it. Perhaps the most simplest is a fragile state is a state that is not capable or is threatened by external shocks. But some of you might have heard of some legislation that was passed 2 years ago called the Global Fragility Act. The Global Fragility Act is something that I and colleagues are spending a lot of time on, where it was US Congress basically telling the executive branch of the US government, after 20 years of not doing very good job in places like Afghanistan and places like Iraq, we, the executive branch, has got to do a better job of working in these countries better. I can go into it in detail, but the first thing we had to do is come up with a strategy, and we found out in the strategy and in the process of trying to pick 5 to 7 priority countries that no one wants to be called fragile. And it was very hard for us to engage countries around the world and say, hey, we want to make you a priority because you're fragile. No one wanted to become fragile. In this administration, in light of what happened in January 6th and others, this administration has embraced the fact that all states have some things that threaten them, and all states can be fragile in some ways. And we need to be very open about that. So when we go to a place like Haiti We're not saying we've figured this out and you haven't. We're saying all of us need to work together to try to make each other stronger. And that gets to your second point, which is, why does this matter? Who cares? Why do I care about Haiti? Well, if you look at a map, Haiti's not very far away from Florida. And if we don't want to have another tens of thousands of people showing up on our shores, maybe we should help Haiti out. Now, USAID, Agency for International Development, is a very large organization. It's almost $30 billion a year. I'm a terrible representative of most of that because I work just in a few little sliver of countries that are fragile. But our overwhelming mission for everything we do is that we promote prosperous, peaceful societies. And if you buy into what I think is a simple argument, we're all better if there's more prosperous and more peaceful societies in the world, then it is worth the United States taxpayer dollars to try to make these places more prosperous, more peaceful, and therefore less fragile.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to move on to Devyn now.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins, for being here. So my question involves kind of decisions around humanitarian aid. So the US, they do provide some states with humanitarian aid, while other states do not receive aid. So what conditions have to be met for the US to consider sending humanitarian relief to a fragile state? Or otherwise stated, why does the US send humanitarian relief to some states and not to others?
Well, thank you, Devyn. And you must have a great score on Room Raider, because that's a great background. I just have a stupid office at the Ronald Reagan building. So humanitarian is a very technical defined term. So within everything that USAID does, Agency for International Development, there's a subset of that that is humanitarian. Our State Department also does humanitarian assistance for refugees. That's when people leave the borders of their country. Otherwise, they're internally displaced if they've moved out of their homes, but they're still inside their home country. And humanitarian assistance is provided on the basis of need. That's all. Ideally, politics should not play a role at all in any decisions made about humanitarian assistance. So if a country has, let's say, an earthquake, it could be Iran. Some years ago, getting old now, January 26th, day after Christmas, Iran had a major earthquake. This is a country we do not talk to. We do not have diplomatic relations with Iran, but they had a massive earthquake. And we went to them and say, do you need assistance? Now, what has to happen is the country has to need the help and the country has to want our help. If those two things are there, then we can declare a disaster and provide humanitarian assistance. We have provided humanitarian assistance to Cuba. We've provided humanitarian assistance to North Korea. We are providing humanitarian assistance, huge amounts of humanitarian assistance right now in Yemen. So politics should not play a role in the decision of who needs help, who needs assistance. And a lot of that is done through the United Nations. That's sometimes easier than working through NGOs. Having said that, my humanitarian colleagues here in the building, I do sort of give them a hard time and say, how can any part of the US government truly not be political? Because it all comes into play. And if you're looking at any of these countries, if you inject millions of dollars, sometimes billions of dollars of assistance into that country, obviously you are going to be affecting the political economy of that country. And you have to be eyes wide open of who you're helping, how you're helping, and what the political effects might be of that assistance. But providing that assistance in the first place is based purely on the needs of the people in that country and the inability of that country to meet the needs on their own, and a welcome mat from them that says, yes, please come in and help us. Hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and moving on to Salah, I think you'll have a broader question that moves away from the humanitarian aspects. So Salah?
Yeah, so first off, thank you, Mr. Jenkins, for coming and speaking with us today. My question is going to deal a little bit more with kind of the implications of foreign aid and how foreign aid kind of ties into broader political developments. So this past year, we've seen a resurgence of military coups throughout Africa, and some observers have noted that this recent cascade has only been rivaled by the wave of coups the continent experienced in the 1960s. Could you speak a little bit about the types of steps that the United States can take to preemptively stop these events from happening, especially regarding the use of foreign aid?
So thank you for such an easy question that doesn't have any, just one or two easy answers. It's really heartbreaking what's happened this last year, 18 months in West Africa and Central Africa, if you include Chad. As Owen knows, for the last several years, my bureau in particular, but has been taking a intensive look at West Africa involving the Sahel and coastal West Africa. A lot of that is around countering violent extremism and the deteriorating situation in the Sahel. Unfortunately, things only continue to get worse. And yes, with Chad, Guinea, Sudan twice now, Mali, Burkina Faso, someplace that's close to my heart. We are all watching very closely Niger. A bad neighborhood has gotten worse very quickly. And our government is currently working on a new strategy for the Sahel. And if you've been watching, things in the Sahel are not getting better, they're getting worse. The French have decided to pull out. The Wagner Group, Russian mercenaries, have now gone in. Judging from their track record in Central Africa Republic and Mozambique, things will not get better under Wagner, say nothing about Libya. And all we have, and Burkina Faso was a partner, weak as it was. Now we have a military government there, and we're left with Niger, who is a very willing partner. There's political will there in the Nigerian government to try to do something about this scourge of violent extremism, but is very weak. And a troubling thing about this rash of coups, speaking with African colleagues just the last few weeks, is they're quite popular, some of them. Among some of the populations, the huge youth bulge in all of these countries means that the people that are now, the majority of people in those countries weren't around to remember all those coups in the 60s and the 70s that you referenced. They've only seen failed, fragile kleptocracies, bad government. They've seen what is being called democracy failing. And then you have these strongmen that come in and say, let us liberate you from these civilians. We'll put this back on track. We'll go to elections. We've all seen that before. But many of these people in these countries haven't seen that. Now, your question's harder than that. What can we do to prevent these? Well, that's hard because we obviously have not done a very good job. It's trying to partner with these countries, trying to assist them. You specialize in civil military relations, which is something that we have in our bureau that we focus on, trying to help the members of these militaries understand what is the role of a military in a modern liberal democracy, even though these are very weak, at best, modern liberal democracies. It was pointed out to me just the other day that we're offering assistance in a country with new assistance from our military. And what usually happens is we go in and we train elite troops who could be the best of the best. And there's a lot of laws about who can receive training and the vetting they have to go through and make sure that those units and those individuals have no records of human rights violations. But in discussions with our AFRICOM was talking to this country just last week, saying we would like to engage with you and come in and help train your forces. That country went right back to him and say, hold on a sec. It looks like most of the coups that are happening are forces that you trained, because it's the elite special operations forces that we usually train. And those tend to be the ones that have the access to the palace and kick out the president. So they're thinking, wait, maybe your assistance isn't going to be helpful for us in the long run, which is a good point. A lot of studies, and you probably know this, have gone in saying what we should try to do more is to train not the elites, but to try to work with those lower level regular troops that are the ones out in the hinterlands that are actually doing the fighting. Those are the ones that tend to commit human rights violations. Those are the ones that tend to, if they don't do their job well, actually create a bigger extremist problem by making extremists, not by getting rid of extremists. But that's a whole different way of looking at our training, and it's also a much bigger, it's a lot more people that would have to be trained. And that is way more than we have currently available for assistance in Africa. If anyone's been watching the news, you've seen, even starting the last administration, this pivot towards Asia, and they're talking about the great power competition. China, and to a lesser degree, Russia. We're getting away from the term great power competition. I never liked it. I don't think they are great, and why should we hand them the greatness that they want? But it is a competition in places, and Africa is not seen as the place for that competition. I disagree. I actually think Africa is exactly where we should be competing. But when it comes to attention, that's diplomatic and military attention, the focus until recent events in the last month in Ukraine has very, very, very much been focused more on China, more on the pivot to Asia, less on Africa. I'm thinking we'll see. We don't know yet what events in Ukraine mean for the future, but we know it's going to change a lot on a lot of fronts. And it is going to lead to a reassessment of what we really need to be focused on. And I hope part of that reassessment is we need to be focused on fragile states and places, particularly in Africa, but not only in Africa. You also work in the middle on the Middle East, where we need to be looking at how are we trying to keep democracy from backsliding? How are we trying to stop this rash of coups? What is the attention, and how do we garner the attention and the focus to try to work with these governments at their time of need before it becomes too hard? As you probably know, once there's a coup and we determine that it is in fact a coup, then we are forbidden by law of providing assistance to that government. Last week, I was in a meeting with a very senior official from the African Union who was arguing that's exactly backwards. He was saying what you need to do is be able to work with these military juntas so you can go in and have influence. But when we step aside and say we're not going to help you, they see that as us giving up on them, and they pivot to other people that might not have their best interests at heart. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question. I hope it got to the gist of it.
Yeah, that was a great answer. Thank you.
And I think we can circle back around to Abbey if you have a brief question before we start to move towards wrapping things up.
Yes. So many times we see only the negative fallout of U.S. involvement in failed and fragile states, most recently in Afghanistan. Can you give an example of U.S. involvement with a fragile state which ultimately resulted in strengthening the state?
So most of you, if not all of you, are probably too young to have lived through what was the Balkans in the 90s. Now, Bosnia remains and probably will always be teetering on the brink. But there was a ghastly, people say this is the first war in Europe right now since World War II. Not true. It's on a scale that we haven't seen. But Bosnia, Croatia, Kosovo, Northern Macedonia, Serbia, all of those places were fragile. All of those places were much worse off. To go to a place like North Macedonia today, to go to a place like Kosovo, it is so much better than things used to be. I spent time in Sierra Leone. In fact, the Marines pulled me out in 1997 after a coup, funny enough. In the 90s, when one looked at Liberia and how long and how bad civil war had been there, and then over the border in Sierra Leone, people looked at it and said, I don't see any hope. Liberia and Sierra Leone are doing much, much better. They're now actually sort of oases. I'm not going to knock on wood because things can always change. But when you look at West Africa, I'm worried right now about Togo. I'm worried about Benin. I'm worried about Cote d'Ivoire. I'm worried about Guinea. I'm not so worried about Sierra Leone and about Liberia. Things have gotten much better there. Cote d'Ivoire was a wonderful place in the 80s and early 90s. Then it went through its own civil war. Now Cote d'Ivoire is pulled out of civil war. We're trying to make sure that things don't get worse there too. So there are many examples. If you look in Latin America, there are some hard cases. I see Owen sitting in Lebanon right now. I envy him because I love Beirut, but also Lebanon is one of those countries that I have no idea how we try to fix that place. Maybe Owen will come back with some solutions. It's so hard. So places do get better. Things do get better over time. There is reason to have hope, but there are other ones, Somalia, South Sudan, which we try and we try and we try, but it's just really hard to make a difference.
Okay, thank you. And I'll ask what will kind of be a follow-up question. You started to touch on this a little bit, but could you talk a little about how, in practical terms, over the last few years, we've seen a major broad global crisis with COVID, and now, right now with Ukraine, we obviously have, you know, a conflict of massive importance that is obviously going to distract people from places like the, you know, more broadly what we might think of as the global South. Could you talk a little bit more about how you see these sorts of, you know, like attention-grabbing crises and how they might act as a distraction from programs that your office is trying to do elsewhere?
Well, thank you for that. And it is rather amazing. And after 24 years in government, I shouldn't be surprised, but I still am, by how our massive government gets consumed by just one thing at a time. There are a lot of people in my building pre-COVID, not a lot of people yet back in our building, a lot of people working from home. But I would say probably the majority of the people that are in the building today are working on Ukraine one way or another. And the system by which decision making and policy making happens at the White House is there are things called deputies committee meetings where the number twos of each agency comes together and they meet. And then if they can't make a decision, it goes to a principals committee, which is all the heads, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, my boss, Samantha Power, the Administrator of USAID. And if they really need to make a big decision or they can't reach an agreement, then they have a true National Security Council meeting, which is the same bunch of people, but chaired by the President of the United States. There are probably 2 deputies committee meetings a day on Ukraine right now. And that's been going on for a month. That means you're taking the number 2 of each agency and you're putting them in 3 hours of meetings, and they have to prep before each meeting. That's a lot of focus on Ukraine, a lot of focus on Ukraine. Now, have we stopped doing everything else? No. Work continues globally on all the things they were on before, but there is a thing in the bureaucracy about where is the attention, where are the decisions being made, that you can't help but not have problems that go through the system when you can't get leaders' attention to make decisions in a timely fashion. When Congress is so focused, and I'm very happy to see how Congress in a bilateral way came together, the supplemental budget that we went to Congress with on Ukraine, we were hit by a universal come back and ask for more. That's not something we deal with a lot. Now, unfortunately, though, the COVID supplemental, because we need more money for COVID, both domestically and internationally, became a victim of the Ukraine supplemental. And they said, okay, here's more money than you want for Ukraine, but you're not going to get the money you want for COVID. So that's a long way of saying in our very big government, we over-focus very quickly. And then later, people back off, the news gets a little bit less Ukraine and more other things, and we get back to a steady state until the next crisis. I don't know what the next crisis will be, but I do think, as I mentioned a little bit before, as David Ignatius said, the post-Cold War world era is over. We don't know what the new era is, but we kind of took our eye off the ball for 25 years and thought we'd fix this thing with Russia and Europe and that everything was going to be happy, and that we weren't going to have to worry about tanks and land wars and things like that. Well, now Putin has put us back into a place where we have to reassess. I don't know where that reassessment is going to lead us. I don't know how long it's going to take. It looks like Ukraine could be a very long, hard slog, and maybe our attention will have to stay focused on that for quite some time. But we have it's an exciting time for all of you to be getting graduate degrees or undergraduate degrees in international relations, because it is a new era in international relations. There are going to be a lot of new books written. There are going to be a lot of new things to study, and you guys are living in real time. So congrats for picking your majors and your degrees, your choice of degrees today.
Thank you, Dr. Powell, Abigail, Devyn, and Salah. We wish you all the best Thank you, Mr. Jenkins, for being with us today, for engaging with our students in this informative discussion and sharing your perspectives and experiences. That's all for this episode of Why Does It Matter? Thank you all for watching from the University of Central Florida's Office of Global Perspectives and International Initiatives. See you next time.